New species are discovered all the time. But sometimes a new species is discovered that's so surprising it makes international news. In this video, we're looking at 10 surprising discoveries of new species of plant and animal. Welcome back to All About Nature. On my channel, I try to bring nature-related content that's both educational and entertaining. If you like this kind of content, then please consider liking the video, leaving a comment, or even subscribing to the channel. I really appreciate your support. Now let's get into the video. While plenty of small species are regularly discovered, it isn't very often that we discover something as large as a new species of whale. But in 2021, that's exactly what happened. A whale called the finback was documented in the Gulf of Mexico as far back as 1790, and by the 20th century it was considered to be a local population of bride's whale. But the whales had a few features that made them unique. For one, they didn't seem to migrate out of the Gulf of Mexico or mingle with any other populations of bride's whale. They also have a distinct set of vocalizations from bride's whales. And while they look essentially indistinguishable, the whales in the Gulf of Mexico had 3 distinct ridges on the top of the head. In the 2010s, the skeletal structure of the whales was closely examined, and researchers discovered that the whales have a unique nasal structure. Genetic testing finally confirmed that the whales were a separate species, and they were given the common name of Rice's whale to honor the cetologist who first suggested that they were likely their own species. Today, Rice's whale is recognized as the most endangered whale species in the world, with only about 100 left, and with only about half of those being mature. Sadly, it seems that the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010 likely killed more than 20% of the population, and the species faces ongoing threats from vessel strikes, pollution, entanglement in fishing gear, and low genetic diversity. While the discovery of a large species is rare, rarer still is the discovery of an entire new order. In 2002, Oliver Zompro, a PhD student in Cologne, Germany, was examining insects trapped in 45-million-year-old European amber when he came across an insect that he couldn't classify with any order of extant insects. He then went to the Museum of Natural History in Berlin to investigate further, when he discovered that the museum had a specimen of the insect in their collection, but it wasn't from millions of years ago, nor was it from Europe. The specimen had been collected in 1909 in a German colony in what is today Namibia. So he contacted the National Museum in Namibia and was shocked to learn that the museum had just received a new specimen of the insect only a few days prior. An expedition to Brandberg Mountain was arranged where the insect had recently been collected, and a population of them was discovered. Known as gladiators, rock crawlers, heel walkers, or mantophasmids, these insects are unique in that they look like a cross between a stick insect and a praying mantis. They generally measure between 1 and 1.5 centimeters in length. While they may look like small stick insects, these nocturnal creatures are actually carnivorous, similar to a praying mantis, but they use their front 4 legs to capture their prey. The new order of insects was added, making it the first new order of insects described since 1914. But as things tend to go with taxonomy, they have recently been reclassified because of some similarities they share with ice crawlers. Since their discovery, 21 living species of gladiator have been described in southern Africa, and 4 extinct species are also recognized. Sao Tome and Principe is a small country found off the west coast of Central Africa. The islands have 176 recorded species of bird, of which 3 owl species were known to exist: the barn owl, the Sao Tome Scops Owl, and the African Scops Owl. But for the past century, there were suspicions that a 4th species existed. As early as 1928, there are records of ornithologists hearing a distinct call in the forests of Principe. The calls were described as a "too" repeated several times in succession, and it seemed that the owls regularly sang in duets. The mystery calls had even been recorded on several occasions. It wasn't until 1998 that anyone started searching seriously for the species. Biologist Martin Mello was on the island of Principe when he heard rumors of a strange bird that was frightening local parrot collectors. Parrots nest in holes in the trees. When the parrot collectors would climb the trees to look in these holes for baby parrots, they would instead find a strange-looking bird with huge eyes staring back at them. Mello had also heard one of the audio recordings of the mystery owl on the island, and he had a suspicion that the birds in the nests and the birds making the mystery calls may be one and the same. But despite his search for the species, it managed to elude him. Then, in 2016, a birdwatcher from the Netherlands shared a photo online of a small owl that he had spotted on the island of Principe, but no one recognized it. When Mello saw the photo, he knew that this must be the species that he had searched for nearly 2 decades earlier. In 2018, he flew back to Principe, this time with Spanish scientist Barbara Freitas. The two made their way to the southern part of the island, to Principe Natural Park, where the owl had been photographed. They met up with park ranger Ceciliano do Bom Jesus, who goes by the nickname Bikegila, and they hatched a plan. Armed with the recording of the owl's call, the group planned to make camp in a remote part of the park, wait for nightfall to play the call, and hope that the owls, which were likely territorial, would approach them to explore the source of the sound. They hiked in, but before they could even finish setting up camp, they heard the familiar call in the forest around them. They managed to capture the owl, and in 2022, the Principe Scops Owl was officially described. They gave it the epithet Otas Bikegila to honor the park ranger who helped them discover it. The owl is only known to occupy an area of about 15 square kilometers within Principe Natural Park. While their range is small, the population density is relatively high, with an estimated 1,000 to 1,500 owls surviving there. Nevertheless, they're listed as critically endangered. In the early 2010s, a team of scientists was performing a biodiversity survey in Jiangxi Province, China. As part of their research, they were collecting the nests of solitary wasps that lived in the forests. 829 nests were collected, brought back to the lab, and reared to adulthood to see what species were present. But the researchers noticed something interesting about some of the nests. In a few of the ones that they had collected from rotting wood, several eggs had been laid, each in an individual compartment. But in the compartment right before the entrance, a number of dead ants had been concealed, stuffed into a tiny space. As the adult wasps hatched, the team noticed that the wasps that came out of the nests with the ants were all of a species that had never been recorded before. But even more interesting to the researchers than finding a new species was discovering the reason as to why these wasps filled the entrances to their nests with dead ants. It turns out that the ants that were used the most, Pachycondyla astuta, also happened to be one of the largest and most aggressive ants in the area. It's believed that the potential parasites to the nests are fearful of this particular ant. Once the ant dies, their bodies release a chemical that warns them off. In fact, this new species of wasp was shown to have only a 3% rate of parasitism to their nests, compared to as much as 17% in other species that were surveyed. The new wasp was given the common name of bonehouse wasp, thanks to this strange behavior of stacking dead ants in the entrance to their nests. Perhaps one of my favorite stories of the discovery of a species is that of the Wollemi Pine, which I actually covered in one of my earliest videos already. On September 10th, 1994, David Noble, a new South Wales National Park field officer, decided to go on one of his many hikes in the Wollemi National Park, which is about 150 kilometers outside of Sydney. On this day, as he came to some narrow, steep-sided sandstone gorges, David made one of the biggest botanical discoveries of the century. Being a park ranger, he had quite a bit of knowledge of plants in the area, so he was surprised that this valley housed one that he had never seen before. And it wasn't just a small, solitary plant. David encountered a grove of just under 100 massive trees, some as much as a meter in diameter, reaching heights of 40 meters. Noticing the strange features of the trees, David made the decision to take some cuttings back to a colleague at the national park. 6 months later, the tree was identified. And as it turned out, the trees were very well known to scientists, though no one had ever seen one in person before. In fact, this entire genus was thought to have died out millions of years ago. There are fossils of Wollemi pines as old as 200 million years. The species was believed to have been common in eastern Australia until about 40 million years ago, when it started to die out. The trees were viewed as part of the distant past, food for ancient herbivorous dinosaurs. No one suspected that they were still holding on, unchanged, in a tiny gorge near Sydney, Australia. The location of the trees was made top secret and remains so today. Fear of outsiders visiting the gorge and introducing new diseases has made this necessary to protect the trees. Thankfully, it turns out that the Wollemi pine is easy to grow and clone. They tolerate a huge range of temperatures from as high as 45 degrees Celsius down to as low as -12, and are easily grown in pots, both in and outdoors. Thousands have since been cultivated for private collections and public gardens. In fact, when I was recently in Melbourne, I visited the Royal Botanic Gardens, Victoria, and made a point to find the Wollemi pine that they had in their collection. And I'm pretty sure that people thought I was crazy as I took about 1 million pictures of it. There are only about 100 wild trees still surviving, and of course, they're listed as being critically endangered and are threatened by wildfires and a virulent water mold that has already been detected in the trees and was probably introduced by unauthorized visitors to the site. In the not-so-distant past, Australia was full of unique megafauna. But when humans arrived about 50,000 years ago, most of them were wiped out. In fact, researchers estimate that as much as 85% of the species that weighed over 100 pounds were gone within only a few thousand years of human arrival to Australia. One of the animals the first people encountered was a giant bird that scientists have named Newton's Thunderbird. As far back as the late 1800s, fossils of a large flightless bird were known about, but due to the lack of complete specimens found, its true identity was unknown. Then, in 1913, paleontologists in South Australia discovered some bones in a lake bed that would give them some clues about what type of bird the Thunderbird actually was. While bones from the limbs and body are helpful for identification, what was really needed was a skull. And there in that lake bed was the partial skull of this giant Thunderbird. Despite the bad quality of the bones, researchers were able to determine that the Thunderbird stood about 2 meters tall and weighed around 230 kilograms, making it roughly twice the size of an ostrich. They named it Newton's Thunderbird, after ornithologist Alfred Newton, and they guessed that it was probably most closely related to modern-day ground-feeding fowl like turkeys, chickens, and quails. 101 years later, in 2014, a team of researchers returned to that lake to see if they could find any more remains of the bird. And amazingly, they not only found more bones, but also a complete skull. And as it turns out, the Thunderbird wasn't exactly what scientists had previously thought it was. The bill was the most striking part. Instead of looking like other extinct species of Thunderbirds, it was more goose-like, being more flattened. This led them to the conclusion that instead of being closely related to ground-feeding fowl, it was probably more closely related to waterfowl, being compared to the extant screamers of South America. Images of what this giant goose-like Australian bird looked like were recently produced, and their new identity made international news. The green anaconda is one of, if not the largest snake species in the world. Females can measure up to 5.2 meters long and weigh as much as 80 kilograms. They live across tropical South America, east of the Andes, and on the Caribbean island of Trinidad. It was described as Eonectes miranus in 1758, and until recently, it was one of 4 recognized species of anaconda. But as early as 1801, scientists were noticing that there were some confusing variations among the green anaconda population. First, there seemed to be a color difference between the more northern and southern populations, but this was later disproved. Then it was noticed that the scale count between those in the north and those in the south was also not quite the same, but some scientists also dismissed this argument. When differences in genital structure were found, this was also presented as evidence that the two groups might represent different species. Again, it was dismissed. But in 2024, a new study was released by Australian researcher Brian G. Fry that claimed to offer definitive proof that the two groups were in fact separate species. Genetic testing has been done on anacondas from across South America, and Fry claims that the results clearly show that the northern and southern populations have a genetic difference of 5.5%, indicating that they should be considered distinct species. While 5.5% may not seem like much, for comparison, humans and chimpanzees only have a genetic difference of 2%. Fry proposed that the green anaconda should be split into 2, with the southern green anaconda maintaining the original Latin name, and the new northern anaconda being called Eonectes acayima. Some scientists were quick to reject this proposal, claiming that the genetic markers Fry used to make his determinations were not reliable, and that the Latin name that he proposed breaks the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature. Despite the criticism, most researchers seem to be in favor of the naming of this new species of anaconda, and while it currently remains disputed, we may soon have a 5th known species added to the list. In 1895, botanist John Medley Wood was in Ngoya Forest in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, when he came upon a unique species of cycad. It looked almost like a species of palm, with a tall woody trunk and a cluster of thick green leaves at the top. The plant was living in a small area on a steep cliff, and Wood found not one, but 4 clusters of the plant, with all of them being male and all of them being offshoots of a single plant. Despite further searching, no other members of the species were found. In 1899, a few of the small basal offsets of the main stem from one of the clusters were collected in order to propagate the plant. Over the next few years, several botanic gardens in South Africa, the Republic of Ireland, and the UK managed to obtain specimens and work at propagating the cycad. In 1916, the last remaining wild plants were in serious decline. They were moved to botanic gardens, and the species became extinct in the wild. The amazing thing about Wood's cycad is that, despite numerous expeditions to rediscover it, no other wild specimen has ever been found. Despite the fact that around 500 exist in gardens today, all of them are clones of the original male plant, and it's considered one of the rarest plants in the world. In January 1862, Charles Darwin received a shipment of orchids from horticulturist James Bateman, who was working in Madagascar. The species today is known as the Star of Bethlehem orchid. These orchids have an extremely long spur, which is the nectary of the flower, that measures as much as 35 centimeters long. Darwin was shocked by this, as there was no known species that had a long enough proboscis to pollinate a flower like this. He wrote to a friend, "I have just received such a boxful from Mr. Bateman with the astounding Angraecum sesquipedalia, with a nectary a foot long. Good heavens, what insect can suck it?" Darwin predicted that if the flowers have a nectary as much as 35 centimeters long, then there must exist some large moth in Madagascar that also has a proboscis that length. 5 years later, naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace read Darwin's prediction, and he agreed. He further expounded that it would not just be a large species of moth, but likely a species of Sphinx moth. He knew of a species from mainland Africa that had an exceptionally long proboscis, called Xanthopan morganii. He suggested that scientists should search to see if this species was also present on Madagascar, because in his opinion, they were a good candidate as the mystery pollinator. But this was quite a risky prediction, not only because this species wasn't known from Madagascar, but also because even the moths on the mainland didn't have a proboscis that reached 35 centimeters in length. Nevertheless, entomologists Charles Oberthur and Paul Mabille searched for the moth in Madagascar, and amazingly, they managed to find and capture both a male and a female of the species. They sent them off to moth experts Walter Rothschild and Carl Jordan, who measured the length of the proboscis. And to their surprise, the Xanthopan morganii specimens from Madagascar had an even longer proboscis than their mainland counterparts, being the perfect length to pollinate the Star of Bethlehem orchid. It was described as a new subspecies and given the epithet Xanthopan morganii praedicta. The subspecies' common name is Wallace's sphinx moth, in honor of Alfred Russel Wallace, who predicted their presence on the island of Madagascar. No list of shocking species discoveries would be complete without mentioning the famous Coelacanth. In 1938, a museum curator named Miss Marjorie Courtney Latimer was walking through a fish market near the mouth of the Chalumna River in South Africa when she saw something surprising in the catch of a local fisherman. A large fish with strange appendage-like fins. It wasn't just the strange appearance of the fish that caught her eye. In fact, She had seen this fish before. It had been documented over 100 years earlier. But the amazing thing is that these fish were only known from Australian fossils that were as much as 410 million years old. They disappeared from the fossil record entirely 66 million years ago, and were of course assumed to have been prehistoric fish that were now long extinct. So what was this fish, a coelacanth, doing here in a fish market in South Africa millions of years after its supposed extinction? Miss Courtney Latimer made some sketches of the fish and sent them on to J.L.B. Smith, an ichthyologist at Rhodes University. He sent her back this telegram. Most important, preserved skeleton and gills. Fish described. Scientists had believed that coelacanths were transitional species that marked the move of animal life from water to land. They hypothesized that the strange fins were used by the fish to move on land as well as in the water. But as it turns out, these fish are not only entirely aquatic, but they don't use their fins for movement on the ground at all, not even on the sea floor. They use their strange fins to float in deep water currents, catching whatever floats by. In 1999, another species of distantly related coelacanth was discovered off the coast of Sulawesi in Indonesia. Both are considered critically endangered. And that's it for today's video. What other surprising stories of discovery do you know of? Tell me about them in the comments below so I can make a part 2. I need to say a special thanks to my patrons. Without their ongoing support, I wouldn't be able to produce these videos. If you want to support the channel, consider joining us on Patreon. The link is in the video description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.